Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to see so many friendly faces here for what is promising to be a really exciting event. My name is Harry Cortapena. I'm Director of Research and Engagement here at IPPR, and we are the UK's leading progressive think tank. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all this evening, together with our partners, FES, to what is a really topical and timely discussion. In a representative democracy like our own, there is hardly a more important question than who represents us in Parliament and who makes decisions on our behalf. And given we are in the midst of another scandal about representation in politics, about the quality and the behaviour of elected representatives, I think is a really exciting moment to have this discussion. A recent poll by IPPR found that about 2/3 of voters feel that their representatives are largely looking out for their own interests rather than the interests of the country as a whole. And that was up from 1/3 in 1944. So there's been a huge decline in trust in our politicians and in our politics over the last 3/4 of a century. And the causes of that crisis are many and complex, as are the solutions. But part of the solution has to be connecting voters with their representatives more. Who is it that we want to represent us? What skills and characteristics do we want to see in our representatives? And whose interests do they serve? These are the questions that we want to tackle here this evening. These have always been topical conversations, and political parties have been doing more and more in recent years to try and ensure that their representatives are reflective of society as a whole. But there's still a long way to go. So as the paper that FES have published recently, and that sets the tone for today's conversation shows, we're still some way off a 50-50 split, or there and thereabouts, on gender. There's still progress to be made on the race gap in representation in Parliament. But also there's massive progress to be made on class and also education, whether our politicians have gone to university or not. And these gaps really matter. They matter because who is represented in Parliament affects the discussions that Parliament has and the laws that they make. And it also matters because people seeing themselves and feeling that they are represented, we know has an impact on their trust in politics and also their inclination to vote. So we should care deeply about these representation gaps that still persist in Westminster, and we should be asking our political parties to do more to try and close those gaps. And that's why I'm delighted that we're here to host tonight's conversation, and why we're also publishing research in the coming weeks on this topic, including policy recommendations on how we could do this to try and raise the profile of this issue as parties begin to select their candidates ahead of the next election. So I'm absolutely sure that we won't come up with all the answers here tonight, but I think we can give it a really good shot. And to help us with this, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Angela Rayner as our keynote speaker. She is Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, and she has been a passionate champion of better representation in politics since she entered Parliament. Just to say she's going to have to dive off a little bit early, so please forgive her as she goes off to her next engagement, but she's with us for the next 45 minutes or so. And we're really delighted that you've made time to come and talk about this really important topic, Angela. After Angela's speech, we will have a brief time for questions for Angela, and then we will move on to our amazing panel, which will be chaired by Path from IPPR. So welcome, Angela, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Harry, for that introduction and for this really important research. And thanks IPPR and FES for the invite this evening. I'd like to start, first of all, with a little bit of opera. Don't worry. I'm not going to start singing to you, she's fine. I've done enough of that over the weekend. But this last week has been a talking point about working class representation, and it has made it quite more topical before I agreed to speak to you this week, that it has been in the news quite recently because of course, the Deputy Prime Minister took me on at PMQs last week and sneerily questioned why I should be attending the opera at Glyndebourne, and it certainly provoked quite a bit of discussion. One about prejudice, about stereotypes and participation, but also gave a platform, I think, for working class people who enjoy opera and those that even perform and direct in operas to talk about these issues as well. So that was a good thing. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, appears to think that opera isn't for people like me, and there's a snobbery around the attitude of Boris Johnson's Conservatives. But it's not only sad, it's embarrassing for our country, I believe, and working class people, the length and breadth of Britain, face outdated attitudes every single day, being constantly looked down on and told that they're not good enough. And I think that was a clear example. What was wonderful was the response that we got from the public, and it always gives me, regardless of what I've put up with, whether that's the Daily Mail talking about my legs or whatever else, and where I come from and my class and my status, what always gives me great pride and gives me the confidence to carry on is I think that the vast majority of the public actually respond to this very badly. So there is hope out there that the public are not with people who think that these barriers should exist. And while the Tories sow their culture wars, Labour backs those working to wider access in public life. And this research is so important to shining a light on that and what really practical steps, because warm words do not get you into the powers, into the corridors of powers where we need people. And I have to admit to you, it does sometimes feel like snobbery follows me around a bit like a bad smell. When I was first elected as an MP, it was a bit of an eye-opener. When I first went into Parliament, because, you know, the building is like Hogwarts, and I'm sure if you've gone to a private school and had some of those privileges of the facilities there, it is kind of surreal for someone that's come from my background. And I stood at the dispatch box, and it always amazed me. I touch it, I'm like, because the people that have been stood at that dispatch box before me, and it's got like little smooth marks where people have rubbed it before, and I think about the people that have sort of rubbed that dispatch box before me, and it is surreal to stand there and the building and all the institution of democracy. It is something that is to be treasured and something to be valued, but it won't be valued if it's only for the select few and people don't see how they can affect change for themselves. So, and I was all of a sudden mixing with people from huge wealth and privilege and expensive educations. And I remember having a joke once with one of the Conservative MPs, and I was talking about the issues in our estate because the horses at the time, they was just let run wild and they were churning up the grass, and there was loads of complaints about it. And this Conservative MP said to me, "Oh, we have llamas on our estate." And I'm like, I'm not talking about a country estate. I'm talking about the horses on the council estate where they was causing loads of trouble. So our two worlds collided right there and then. And I thought, what planet have I landed on? But it was quite good, humoured and fun. But it's certainly a world away from where I grew up. In the playground, I was the poorest of the poor kids, and school was a chance for me, in essence, to get a hot meal at lunchtime. And because I didn't have breakfast, you know, there was nothing in the cupboards for us when we went to school. So I often went to school thinking about just how I was going to eat that afternoon and what fantastic puddings. Everyone used to moan about school meals, but I loved them. The puddings in particular were amazing. And on the council estate where I grew up, as you might imagine, I was a bit bullied because he had ginger hair. It was a thing then. Everyone loves it now, but when I was young, people didn't. And my mum couldn't read all right, and she suffered from bipolar, so she had a very difficult time herself. And I was 6 months pregnant by the time I collected my GCSE, so that was quite an interesting walk of shame for me as I went to collect my GCSEs. And I remember being very judged for it as well, and I remember all eyes on me for that. And I remember being told that I'd never amount to anything and that I'd be on benefits for the rest of my life. And you can imagine what my career's advice was as well. It wasn't that I was going to be deputy leader of the Labour Party and deputy prime minister elect. But you know, everyone just sort of wrote me off at the time. And there was an unspoken hierarchy. Doctors were people that cured you. They weren't people like you. Police were people that kept you in line. They weren't people like you. Teachers were people that taught you. They were not people like you. There was an unspoken class system that affected me right from an early age that I wasn't conscious of, but it basically said, these are people that do things to you. You're not one of them people. And I think these barriers continue to exist. And when I had my son Ryan, I wanted to prove to everybody that they were wrong. I wanted to be the mum that my mum wasn't able to be, because of course I went to school and I wasn't school ready. I didn't even know that term, school readiness, at the time. But because my mum couldn't read or write, I hadn't had books before I went into school. So I went into school well behind my peers, and that had a significant effect on me. And I remember my nana saying, because my nana did 3 jobs at the time, she grafted, and she said as long as I could put my son to bed, she would have him in the evenings. And that's when I saw a private advert to work for a home care agency, and nobody wanted to work the evening shift, so basically you could walk off the street and get that job. And in that job, I was working, first of all, for a private care agency. And guess what? I was on what we called flexible contract, which AKA we're now known as 0-hour contract at the time. And it was doing that job that I managed to see an advert for working for the council care work, and they got travel time, they got better terms and conditions because they had a trade union. And the girls that I worked alongside said, you should try and apply for that job now you've got experience. I started to work for the council, and that's when I got involved in the union Unison, because the council wanted to outsource the care work industry, and I'd seen what it was like in the private sector. I was like, why would you want to do this? This is crazy. And because I thought managers like to get feedback, I learned that sometimes they don't like that direct feedback. But at that time, I thought the direct feedback was a good thing. The girls who were all a lot older than me, who I worked alongside, said she'd make a cracking trade union rep. And I said, what's a trade union? And the rest is kind of history. And I dealt with equal pay when we were going through equal pay in local authorities, outsourcing the public sector workers. And people often ask me how have I survived the turbulent years of politics. I'd say becoming a trade union rep and being thrown in at the deep end on Section 3175 partnerships, TUPE transfers and everything else kind of got me in the mood and spicy for what I've had to put up with now. But it was going through the ranks of Unison that really got me involved in politics and starting to understand how everything that we do at a local level is very much governed by what happens in central government. And I remember meeting Gordon Brown once in Number 10 because he wanted a home care worker to go and to get the government, Gordon's government, to give capitalisation to pay for the equal pay claims. And I was in Number 10, I thought, this is amazing, wow. And Gordon Brown came up to me and I was like, hiya, Gordon. And when I told my mum this, she's like, oh my God, you called him Gordon, he's the Prime Minister, you have to say Prime Minister. And apparently that was my first learning of the protocols and how people expect you to respond to people in positions of power. But, you know, Gordon Brown was quite chilled about it. And now I get to call him Gordon because I get to call him a friend, so that's nice. And from there on, I did get involved in the Labour Party. I put myself forward as a candidate, thinking they'll never elect someone like me. And guess what? The members in our local Labour Party wanted exactly that, and that's a lesson for us. Never know your place. The amount of times I say that in a room, and I say it to young people all the time, is that the powers that be will try and make you feel that there isn't a place for you, but actually there's so many of the silent majority that are just willing you to do well and wanting someone like you, that I got my first break and got elected to be the MP for Ashton-under-Lyne, the first ever female MP for that constituency. But you know what, I'm not here to just discuss my route into politics today or my experiences of working class representation, but it's about the wider scope of what we're trying to do. And I think it shows actually in my story that representation does matter. And it's not just so that our democratic institutions look more like voters they represent, though that is vitally important. Representation also helps to shape what issues get debated in the first place and what's up for decision. Take the cost of living crisis, which is a big issue at the moment. If you've got no money at the end of the month and your fridge freezer breaks down, you can't get credit. Some people just cannot get the credit, and therefore it feels absolutely impossible to get yourself out of those circumstances. You don't have a couple of quid in the bank that you could just get a fridge freezer just like that. And it's that feeling, that pit, that dread in your stomach about how am I going to cope and how am I going to survive, and the panic really does set in. And I do think that sometimes people in positions of influence, like politicians, they've never had that feeling. I have the luxury now, if my fridge or my washer breaks down, I can go and buy one. I can get credit, I can get zero interest credit flying out of my ears, but my friends, and I still now to this day, a guarantor for many of my family for their rents so that they can get on, and just helped my son out who had bailiffs at the door this weekend, because there's far too many people who are struggling today, and there's far too many politicians and influencers in power that just really do not have an understanding of what it's like. And a classic example is when you have ministers going on the TV telling people to just work a couple of hours longer and then it will be fine. So I do think that lived experiences is absolutely vital to what we do. And you might learn by asking or listening to what people say, but it is very different when you've been in that and that perspective that you bring. And it's perhaps no surprise that working class representatives tend to be more supportive of measures to tackle economic inequality, further redistribution or increase welfare, and to deliver those outcomes. Because again, I think the snobbery around, well, people like, it's a lifestyle choice to live on benefits, the lack of knowledge of the respect, the self-respect that people want and the ability to get on and to help their families. It just, when people make comments like that, it makes me so angry when I hear other politicians saying it's a lifestyle choice to be on benefits, because if you've been on benefits and you've had to go through that humiliation, and if you've had to go to a food bank and feel like you're not able to be successful and provide for your family, I don't think that they truly understand, and you would not say that it's a lifestyle choice if you were in those circumstances. I don't believe they would anyway. And they just don't know the consequences. They've not lived them too. So if you've been in those circumstances, it does shape your frame and the way you see the world. And that's why I think it's really important that this work is undertaken, that we continue to fight for it. And it's one of the most important things that I think I do as a champion of bringing more people forward. I would want to be ironed out as the norm rather than somebody who's unique in politics. That's my what I'm trying to achieve while I'm there. And it was my community, a public sector job, the Sure Start Centre, a library, the trade union that all gave me support when I most needed it. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for all of those public sector levers, those supports, those interventions that helped to get me where I am. And that's what shapes my priorities and makes me such a champion for good public services. And from my own perspective, my background also helps me shape the way I do my politics. Ever since being elected in 2015, I've spent most of my time on the Labour front bench. I think I spent about a month, 6 weeks on the back bench. It's been quite a surreal 7 years. And when I was the Shadow Education Secretary, I developed Labour's proposals for a national education service, and it is one of the things I'm most proud of. And, it's well documented I left school pregnant at 16 with no qualifications, because some of the press like to mention that every single time they do an article about me. So everybody knows that. And some might think, well, how did she develop a national education service? How could she have the knowledge and input to do that if she didn't even finish her own standard education? But I think my background was an asset in that I didn't come to the table with all of the preconceptions about what I think the education system should look like. I didn't have pet projects or prejudice that people often arrive with into the sector. And instead, I was literally given a blank sheet of paper by Jeremy Corbyn and said, develop a national education service. So I was able to go out and listen to people, put my values and judgments and, crucially argue with people and test their thinking on why they think that's the way it should be from all of those experts, right from early years all the way through to tertiary and higher education. And I drew up those proposals working with experts, and I think that gave it much more validation for what we were trying to achieve. And I went from a lot of the vice-chancellors, when I took the higher education bill through Parliament, I remember them looking at me thinking, oh my God, we're stuffed. and after being in the room with me and working with me for some time, thinking, oh my God, she's a force for nature, and I earned their respect. And that's the other thing, a working class person with an accent like mine, a woman, earns respect when they go in the room. They're not giving it. Like Boris Johnson walks in the room, he's from Eton, he's privately educated, he's connected. People think, well, he must know his stuff. When I go in a room, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, maybe it should change that everybody gets that, I have to earn people's respect rather than it just be given to me. So I do genuinely believe that it's better policy making if you do have a variety of people in the room. And while a lot of my experience can be traced back to the development of my confidence, but that didn't happen in a vacuum, it happened through my interaction with others, the informal mentoring that I got, the support networks that were around me. And there are individuals in particular who saw talent in me and gave me support when I needed it, or gave me that little bit of, of a push to say, you should do this, you should go for it. And that was how I progressed through the ranks. It's how I got my opportunity. And I must admit, it was also the ones that told me, you can't do it. Because when someone tells me I can't do something, I go the opposite way. And my dad and mum will probably testify to that. But I do think that some of those opportunities that were there for me, those lifelines, those commitments, those formal structures have been eroded away now, and those opportunities aren't available to people. So while MPs have become more representative in terms of gender and ethnicity in recent years, although there's no room for complacency, we have made some good progress. There is a large and growing representation gap in terms of social class. And social class, I would say, is one of the number one things that I get every single day when I'm doing my job. It's because the routes that I saw, in the case of the Labour Party at least, former miners, factory and other manual workers entering Parliament, they're not. Those routes are being fragmented. Often they'd also been supported through adult education and also through the trade union movement. But for many reasons, those routes, it's becoming increasingly harder for people to take. So I wanted to focus on what replaced it, and more to the point, what hasn't replaced it. It's a tough business standing for election, and a costly one in terms of time and money. The demands on work, particularly low pay and insecure work, make this harder for people to achieve. And those demands restrict supply. We don't have enough people putting themselves forward from my kind of background. I'm sometimes criticised for my blunt way of speaking, as you know. And reporters from Hansard have a bit of a nightmare sometimes transcribing what I say in Parliament and trying to make it look like the House style, which always amuses me. But I don't compromise on what I say and how I say it because it's who I am. There are also many colleagues from different parties who have got working class backgrounds like myself, but it almost gets taken out of them. It's a real frustration for me. I am not unique in Parliament for my working class social economic background, but you wouldn't necessarily think that, because many that are from my background either think you don't talk about it because it's not what people think as a politician. They somehow think it weakens your standing as a politician, and they think that they have to change the way they speak. I remember some little old lady, lovely little old lady once coming up to me, and she said, I absolutely adore you, but it's party, not party. I said, well, from where I'm from, it's party, and it's going to stay party, and I love you to bits, but I'm not going to change the way I speak. And I think far too often people are expected to change who they are to fit that mould, and I think that that's very damaging to getting new people from backgrounds like mine into politics. And I think it really erodes that trust with the voters as well, because voters don't feel that connection, because they don't feel like they have a piece of who the real person is. They feel we triangulate, or that we're standoffish, or that those people are not like them. So I think it's important that people are open and true to who they are and their roots. And I've got in trouble for robust comments. on occasion as well, but it's more authentic, I think, for me to be who I am and how I say it, than trying to tie myself up in knots saying what other people want me to say. I don't deliver lines. I know what the gist of it is. I'll say it the way I see it, and that's the best way for me. And people do often say to me, I don't agree with you on everything, but you say it how you see it, and I like that about you. I don't agree with the point, but I like it, and I think it's a healthy state of affairs for our democracy to be that way. So having spent so many years looking down on being ashamed of my background, I internalised a low sense of self-worth for a long time. But I learned that and then I unlearned that, because I realised that actually that is my unique selling point, and it is what makes me who I am today. And I'm proud of where I come from, and I'm proud of who I represent. And some people say I overshare and Kira undershares. Maybe that's so, because me and Kira are from similar backgrounds. But the reason I overshare is because I like to make people feel that there's a connection with them, and that people have struggles in their life, whatever that struggle is. But I like people to feel that they've got a route to see themselves getting into politics and getting into positions of power. But you know what? I can tell you that, you know, we've had a decade of Eton graduates that have been prime ministers, and it doesn't guarantee you good government. And I'll try not to say too much about the current one, but I think that's an absolute case in point that there's more than a hint of snobbery in the argument that more authenticity and more diversity in politics is a recipe for disaster. David Cameron may have warned the country of chaos, and Theresa May had promised a strong and stable government, but things turned out rather differently, didn't they? So when people from non-traditional backgrounds ask me about putting themselves forward for public life, I tell them, you have the skills to do the job. You need to have passion for making a difference and to care about the people around you, and then you can do it, and you can be amazing in doing that. I try to pay back by encouraging people or giving them a burst of inspiration, because I know how tough it is, and many of the odds are stacked against them still, and that is still the case, if I'm honest. And inspiring words and motivational speeches and role models aren't enough on their own, as I say. The cold, hard reality kills too many talented people's dreams by putting themselves forward and making it through. That's why, and you'll see the trade unions in me here, that's why it's important that people get organised. Thankfully, there's so many organisations and networks, particularly, of course, across the Labour movement, that do fantastic, great work. I came up through the Labour unions, the Trade Union Labour Organisation, Chulo Political School, and also Labour Women's Network. They were crucial for me. I mean, just knowing how to be part of a selection and having those networks. We don't have those networks that others that have come through different routes. So I think it was really important, and I think that the class that I came from, the alumni, we were incredibly successful in getting a diverse group of MPs in, and we were all different. We were all incredibly different. I'm sure for the trade unions that are in this room, it felt like herding cats, getting us all in there. And sometimes we didn't say what the trade unions wanted either, but they felt it was important that there was those working class frontline people that have done the jobs on the ground into Parliament, and I think it is too. Labour Women's Network, I remember them being incredibly brutal when I first went in, and it's like, if you've ever had an abortion or you've had an affair, then tell them right now, because it will come out as soon as you become a candidate. I was like, oh my God. But they were preparing me for what you get when you stand to be a politician. And I do think that people who have had lived experience sometimes do feel ashamed by their past, but I do think it's important that you stand up to your past as well. And Mother Red is doing fantastic work at the moment as well. It's another organisation that's ensuring that childcare costs are paid so that people can go out and do the work. But there is so much more that needs to be done in order to help people get in. I do think that the information is key, but also resources is really key to help people. And I do think those practical barriers are a massive consideration when it comes to getting more people into Parliament. Standing for office is a full-time vocation for weeks, if not months. And it's already exclusionary to those without a flexible employer or significant cash reserves. So you fall at the first hurdle. These barriers to public office end up harming our democracy, in my opinion. We don't get the people coming through. It's in the public interest. And I think that's what's at stake if we don't break down some of those barriers and ensure that people are from diverse backgrounds who represent and govern us. And for some political parties, ensuring working class representation is simply a means to an end. But for the Labour Party, it is core to who we are. And while I've got positions of influence and power in the Labour Party, I will continue to push it. We are not perfect, but I will continue to push it and push hard to make sure that we can continue to do that. The Labour Party was founded 120 years ago by the trade unions, may I add, and some of our social societies, and they give voice in politics to working people, and I'm incredibly proud of my trade union past and my links, and I'll continue to be that, and I'll defend that link going forward because I do think it's really important. And I'd like to end by paying tribute to the work that you're doing and in this area. I'm really looking forward to the report when it comes out in a couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to taking part in the panel conversation that we're going to have now. But our public realm needs to look and sound like our public. People have to have faith in the people that are making decisions on our behalf, and people that understand what goes on in their lives. And I think that that's one of the reasons why people feel that politics doesn't affect their lives and they cannot affect change. I think if they can see that people from their communities, not dropped in from afar, people who are rooted in their communities that sound and look like them, I think that will bring an enrichment to our democracy and will change not just local government, but we've seen it at a mayoral level and we've seen it at a local government and a national government level. So we do need more. I think class is a really significant issue in this country, and I won't stop talking about it until we break down some of those barriers that we face. So I look forward to working with you. I look forward to offending those that don't think people like me should have a voice, and continue to do that in a respectful way, so they don't send me horrible death threats. And I look forward to pushing those boundaries to ensure that more people from working class backgrounds and diverse backgrounds get into politics and get into the levers of power. Thank you.
Can everyone... Yeah, this microphone's working. So we're going to take a few questions for Angela before she has to dive off. If we could have hands up and just say briefly who you are. So we'll go first to... There should be a microphone going. The lady on the left just here. We'll take 3 in a row. So keep your hands up and I'll come to you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for that. It was brilliant. Rebecca from Bradford. I run an organisation called I Have a Voice that's all about getting young people enthused and engaged in politics, perhaps thinking about running for election, but also thinking about all of the jobs that we do in this room as well. And I'd just really love to know your views on the state of citizenship education in the UK and how we can get a greater focus on that so that it's not just people who go to schools that have debating clubs that are equipped to get involved in politics, it's all of us.
Thank you. And take 2 more questions. The lady just here.
Hi, thanks for that, Angela. Bonnie Chung, Vice Chair of Bristol Women's Voice. So you mentioned a little bit about death threats and things, not very nice, negative things happening. What would you say to a young girl or sort of young woman who's thinking about running and worried about things like that, as well as misogyny, racism, because a lot of the kind of lack of representation is from people who are from ethnic minority backgrounds and women, etc. So yeah.
And we'll take one more question. Gentleman at the back.
Hello, Angela. Dan Bloom from The Mirror. We might be getting a verdict from Durham Police soon. If you did have to resign, do you fear that there would be a kind of gap or a hole at the top of the party for the kind of representation that you've provided? And if I may be so cheeky, on current news, Number 10 have told us that Boris Johnson had heard of some claims about Chris Pincher, but sort of nothing in particular, and therefore it would have been unfair to deny him a job. I just wonder what you make of this, whether it's fair to follow that sort of innocent until proven guilty strategy, even when there are sort of rumours about someone in Parliament? Thank you.
Over to
Thank
you,
you.
Angela.
Cheers. Rebecca, I think, one of the things that I found when I was Shadow Education Secretary was the disastrous reforms that Michael Gove brought into education and the lack of respect for teachers in the classroom. Teachers do a tremendously good job. They want to teach citizenship. And I think, it's important that the curriculum is diverse so that people do understand how it relates to them. There's no point in me finding out about Charles I and know not a Scooby-Doo about what's happening in my local area today and how that shapes what's happened. So I do think that, if we were given the teachers they respect that they deserve in the classroom and we work with organisations and the curriculum is flexible enough to work with organisations, actually, I think it would open it up and create more of a debate. The debate is too restricted at the moment, and I think young people are, when I go into school, they're amazing. In fact, Dan's here asking me a question. The young people, Dan, scare me more than you. I've got to say, they're because they're like really robust and they ask the questions that, people need to ask. And I think, if we can diversify our curriculum, make it more flexible and respect our teachers for the professional job that they do and repeal quite a lot of what Gove did, the damaging reforms that Gove did, I actually think our education system would be in a much better place and citizenship would have a crucial role in that. And in terms of the death threats and the situation that I find myself in and what advice I would give to others is I get a huge amount of support, by the way, and I'm not unique as an MP. I thought that when I became deputy leader of the Labour Party, gosh, this is awful, the amount of abuse that I get. My staff have to read it all and have to then measure which bits they send to the police and which bits they think is just somebody being really horrible that you wouldn't say to my face and you certainly wouldn't say it on the street. I hope not anyway. But I'm not unique. Nearly every female MP, and it is misogyny is a very big issue, and also race and ethnicity is a very big issue for MPs. If you're a black woman in politics, how dare you have a voice? That is literally the soundboard that you hear a lot of the time. It's not unique to me. I think there is a culture that's developed that is a lacking of respect for politicians, and I think we've got to take some ownership of that as a collective in what's happened over recent years, and the public have been very angry, and it's triggered some people into saying things and doing things that, quite frankly, everyone who's been convicted, everybody who has been spoken to by the police, by some of the threats I've had, have been absolutely mortified. Nobody stood by their comments after saying it and said, I really shouldn't have said it, and they've admitted it and said, I'm disgraceful and I shouldn't do it. So I do think we have to be more respectful of each other. I do think that means that we can create a better environment for people coming into it. But I also think, like I said, with the Labour Women's Network training, we have to be realistic and equip people, and that means giving them a huge amount of support. My Greater Manchester Police have been absolutely amazing. I'll give them a shout out because they literally are there for me and my children who had received death threats and others. They've been tremendous, and my party have been. They've been dealing with some of the challenges that I face, and my colleagues have. And we've got Caroline Noakes, who's the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, who has been doing fantastic work on this, a Conservative MP as well. So we're coming together to try and create a better environment. But I think we've also, and I think it goes back to our young people as well, is building resilience in people as well, and not making people feel that they don't belong. And that's why one of the proudest things that I think I have achieved in the 7 years I've been in Parliament is working with Nicky Morgan to get compulsory sex and relationship education in schools, because that relationship building that resilience for our young people, I think is really important. Far too many people at an early age are getting mental health problems and anxiety now, and I think there's a real culture in the UK that we need to push back on that I think will help with some of that. But I say that, if our voices are lost because of that, then democracy is lost. And I always encourage other women to support other women and other groups to support each other and to break down some of the abuse that's out there. And then, Dan, in terms of your two questions, I don't think there'd be a gap at top of the party because we have got a diverse party, and I'm not going anywhere. And even if the hypothetical happened, which I'm very confident it won't happen because I'm very confident that I haven't broken any rules. But I do think it was important to state that, because this Prime Minister thinks he can break the law and then continue in office. I think that is a red line for anybody, and I think it's a red line for me. So I'm confident that I haven't, but I think it was very important that we made that point, and that's why I made the point. But, you know, if we were in those circumstances, one of the things that I think is really good about what the Labour Party's done, and you can see that through our representation in Parliament, is we do have more diversity. Like I said in my speech, we've got to continue that path, and I will always be a member of our Labour movement, and whether it was an old Melp at the bottom of the food chain, or deputy leader, or deputy prime minister in government, I'll continue to champion to make sure that it can't just be left to one person. That's my point. It has to be about creating an environment for everybody. So I don't think there'll be a gap. I think that what my job and my role is always is to make sure that if I'm not around tomorrow, then there's lots of other people that can do that role, and that's what's really important. It's not about me, it's about the team and about what you can bring. And in terms of Chris Pincher and the Prime Minister, look, you know, I mean, it sounds like a logical thing to do, but you ask, don't you? There's rumours flying around. Can I ask you the question? Is there anything that you've done that could be considered? And I would have investigated them. If I was the Prime Minister and somebody had said that, I'd have said, you know, these rumours, that's really serious. I want to investigate it. I want to find out if there's any truth to it. I think that's a logical thing. If you worked in HR, if you're a trade unionist or anyone else and someone says, oh, I've heard this rumour, I'd want to find out and see whether that rumour is correct or not, rather than just say, well, it's just a rumour, I'll give you a top job over welfare of other MPs, to be honest. So I find it, it speaks to the character of Boris Johnson, if that's the way he felt to deal with that at that time. I think it's all of our, whether that's on discrimination, whether that's on sexual harassment, on any grounds now, if you hear stuff that goes on in your workplace, you have a responsibility, whether you're the Prime Minister or not, to find out what that is and to find out if there's any truth in what's happening. And I think creating safe spaces where people can raise those issues is important. And Boris Johnson does not create safe spaces because he doesn't uphold the principles of public office, and therefore he demoralises people being able to come forward. And I'll give you one example. When you had the advisor, the advisor that complained about bullying from Priti Patel, and it was found that Priti Patel had bullied that senior advisor, and that senior advisor had to leave, and Priti Patel is still in office. That's what Boris Johnson did, and that's what creates an environment where people can get away with that level of abuse, and it shouldn't be tolerated. And it's Boris Johnson that is the problem, and he should have done something about it. And it's not plausible to me to turn around and say, well, it was just a rumour. It's your job to go out and find out if there's any truth to that rumour and create an environment where people can come forward and feel supported and feel that something will be done about it, not that the perpetrator would be promoted.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you go because I know you've got to get off to your next...
I have, because Anna's, our Scottish leader's down and he's speaking at 6 o'clock, and if I miss him, then it's bad. So I'm sorry.
So all is left for me to say is thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thank you.
Such an inspirational speech, and we look forward to working with you on this issue, this really vital and important issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Angela. I'm going to pass over to Parth Patel, who leads our work on democracy and our panel.
Thanks, Harry. I think I've got a mic, so hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah? Great. Yeah, let's just sit down. Hi, everyone. So thanks, Harry, and thanks, Angela, for those really fascinating set of reflections, I thought, about working class representation in democracy. Kind of the way she weaved between the personal and the political, I think, is only really possible from that endangered species of politician, the working class politician. So what we're going to do as a panel is we're going to reflect on what we've just heard from Angela, as well as zoom out a little bit and think about representation or political representation more broadly in terms of social class, but also how it relates to gender and race. We'll think about why that matters, both for the direction in which public policy travels, but we'll also think about what it means from an electoral perspective. And then we'll think about how can we improve representation within the House of Commons and UK democracy. So with me today, I've got this excellent panel that I'll introduce now, who I should have sat down in a particular order, which I didn't. So we'll start at the far end. Who we've got is Lisa Egbiden, who is an activist and an organizer who's been involved in several projects, really, to improve working class representation across positions of power, including a campaign to make politics in the UK more accessible to working class people, particularly working class young people. Next to Lisa is Professor Rainbow Murray, who is a professor at Queen Mary University, and she has published countless papers about political representation, particularly with regards to gender, but also how gender and class interrelate within representation in politics. Next to Rainbow is Michael Bankole, who is the host of an excellent podcast called Politics Jam, but also a doctoral researcher at King's College London, where he thinks about the representation of minority ethnic communities in the UK within the House of Commons. And finally, we have Michael Jenevine, who has joined us from Vienna, where he is a researcher for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, who have published some really interesting research comparing 5 countries across Europe in terms of how representative their parliaments are with regard to several things, including social class. So I'm going to probably come to Professor Rainbow Murray first. Then I will come to, I think, Michael Bankole, then to Lisa, and then to Michael to finish off. And then we will have a discussion with you and take some more questions from the audience and think about a few more things, hopefully how we can improve representation. So, Rainbow, over to you.
Thank you. I did mute myself before. I think that's working now.
I think we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Well, Angela is a hard act to follow. That was incredibly impressive, but I'll do my best. She said so many interesting things, and some of what came across from her discussion was some of the cultural barriers that both women and people from working class background face, the abuse that they receive, the being put in your place, this world doesn't belong to you barriers. And something that she alluded to but didn't discuss in depth was some of the more structural barriers, some of the resource implications for running. So I'm going to pick up that thread, if that's okay, and elaborate on that a little bit. Why is it difficult to run for office? It costs a huge amount of money. And this is something that people don't think about, because political parties front most of the costs, so people assume it's cost neutral to run for office. But actually the personal cost implications, what you're expected to outlay from your own pocket, comes to about, on average, £64,000 to run for Parliament. Who has that? Obviously a few people do. Most people don't. And so I want to break that down a little bit. What are the real barriers? The first barrier is time. The infamous quote, we all have the same 24 hours. Yeah, but those 24 hours go a lot further when you can outsource stuff to other people, when you can pay someone else to look after your children, to do your cleaning, when you can go to the convenience store rather than travelling further to the cheaper supermarket, when you can buy a ready meal rather than having to cook from scratch. All those things give you more of those 24 hours. And when you don't have that time, especially if you've got caring responsibilities, suddenly the investment of time required for politics goes from being straightforward to very quickly becoming impossible. And time is money in another sense as well, because time is spent in paid employment. And if you're running for office, you're often expected to devote yourself part-time, if not full-time, to the campaign, sometimes for up to 4 or 5 years. Is this better? Shall I turn this off? Better? You can be expected to work part-time or full-time for the party for years. And we're increasingly selecting candidates 3, 4, sometimes nearly 5 years out from an election. That's an awfully long length of time not to be earning money. And again, you need enormous personal resources to be able to weather that. And most people just don't have those resources, so it's an insurmountable barrier. And there's also an attitude in politics that you're supposed to be giving to the party, not taking from it. So some people, ask the question, well, why don't you just tell the party that you can't do it or that you need some extra resources? But they say, well, parties are broke. You turn up at the selection saying, I need you to fund me. They're not going to look at you. They're going to want the person who can say, I can run all of my own campaigns and I can give myself unlimited to the party for the next 5 years. So there's an embarrassment about it. And there's also sort of an expectation, well, you'll raise your own funds, you'll be resourceful. When you go to stay in a constituency, you don't get a hotel, you stay in someone's house. Well, it's easy enough to stay in someone's house if you're not a single woman travelling and you're a bit nervous about staying in a stranger's house. Suddenly, that's where gender and class intersect, and you see that suddenly the expectation that you can do it all by yourself isn't as straightforward as it sounds. And then there's the actual costs, the things, the money that you have to spend. Great, lucky for you if you can run in the constituency where you live. Most people can't. Most constituencies are already tied up with an incumbent. So you've got to travel somewhere else, and that's travel costs. You've got to have a professional-looking campaign just to get through the selection. Candidates I spoke to said that the people with the shiny posters that they'd spent lots of money on were the people who got selected. So you have to have that cash up front just to get past the first hurdle. You have to look the part. You have to dress professionally. A lot of people don't have those smart clothes. They have to go out and invest in them. When you're on the campaign trail, you haven't necessarily got time to do your laundry, but who's going to do your dry cleaning for you? All these little things add up. Women get criticised if they don't have their hair looking nice, but then if they do have their hair looking nice, that costs money as well. You're expected to buy drinks for the people who volunteer for you. They've spent a whole day on the campaign trail for you, and then they sort of expect, you'll buy the first round at the pub afterwards. All these little insidious costs add up, and they become collectively too much of a barrier. And then last but not least, there's the concept of risk. People say, well, it's fine, you can incur those costs, you can get a lovely cushy paid job at the end of it. Well, great, maybe not. And who are the safe seats generally reserved for? It's not the people that are coming up from underrepresented groups. They're normally going for the swing seats, the ones that are harder to win. They often have to prove themselves 2 or 3 times before they actually get into office. And risk itself is cultural. If you're a woman, you're generally socialised to take fewer risks than a man. If you come from a working class background and you don't have that safety net beneath you, you're not going to have the same confidence to say, well, I can take a risk because what's the worst that's going to happen? If I fall, someone will catch me. If you know that taking that risk could mean that you send your family bankrupt, suddenly it's not such an attractive prospect and you're going to let someone else do it. So all of those things add up. And then when you factor in those additional things that Angela was talking about, the psychological barriers, the being told that a place isn't for you, being attacked on social media and by the press every time you speak out, you can see very quickly how politics ends up being a rich man's world and how difficult it is to break those barriers. But then on an optimistic note to conclude, she did also talk about some of the ways that you can overcome them. So trade unions, which have for a long time been a male-dominated space, are increasingly becoming more inclusive of women. That can be a very useful route into power. Taking advantage of things like networks. And I think political parties also just need to invest more to recognise the need to have diversity in the room. And I think Angela advocated very effectively for why we need that diversity. So I think the next step now is we need to put our money where our mouth is.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Rayner. Really nicely spelled out. And maybe in the Q&A we can come back to those potential solutions to improve class representation. Michael, I'm going to come to you next. Michael Bencole, that is.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to touch on something similar to Rainbow, but from a race perspective, speaking about the intersections between race and class. And I think a lot of what Angela was speaking about earlier was quite fascinating in terms of the environment in politics and how daunting it was for her when she first walked into politics, because I conducted some research with minority MPs who were elected for the first time in 2019. Now, they've had a turbulent experience because they were elected in 2019, December, and then COVID happens, and this has been a crazy experience for them. But I wanted to find out from them why they think minorities are underrepresented in the House of Commons today, and what they think potential solutions are for that. Now, just to kind of speak about where we are with minorities in politics today, so it's an interesting story because we have seen lots of progress and lots of reasons to be optimistic. So we look back to 1987 when the first 4 were elected. They were just 4 out of 650 MPs. That's not a lot of people, right? We're now in a position in 2022 where we have 66 MPs from minority ethnic backgrounds. That's 1 in 10, or just over 1 in 10. So we have loads of reasons to be optimistic and loads of reasons to be happy. But there are still some issues when it comes to underrepresentation in the House of Commons when it comes to race. So I conducted some interviews with MPs who were elected for the first time, minority MPs who were elected for the first time in 2019. I asked them what they thought the barriers to politics were. And there were kind of 3 barriers that they thought were sort of the most prevalent barriers for minorities in the House of Commons. The first one is the cost of politics, which is something that Rainbow's touched on, something that Angela touched on as well. Most minorities in Britain are working class, they're disproportionately working class. They haven't got thousands of pounds to spend on campaigns. And when it comes to like general elections, Most general elections happen every 4 years. We've had a period where we've had elections every 2 years, so 2015, 2017, 2019. That's actually more beneficial for minorities because what happens is the cost of politics reduces because you only have a short period to campaign, so there's less money. But generally speaking, it's every 4 or 5 years you have an election. That's a lot of time to take time off work, to invest in a campaign. And unfortunately, the minority MPs I interviewed, they said, but that's just a lot of money for people. Ethnic minorities in this country cannot afford to campaign for that long period of time. I think the second thing that sort of I found in my interviews was the idea of the culture and politics in Britain today. Now, Britain is a far more inclusive place today than it was 20, 30 years ago. There's been tons of progress across all sectors. But unfortunately, when it comes to politics, there are some issues in terms of what happens to minority MPs once they are elected. So we see that in 2017, for example, going into that election, the most abused MP by some distance was Diane Abbott. She received horrible death threats, racist abuse, kind of gendered abuse as well. That's going to deter other minorities from putting themselves forward because they see her experience in politics and they think, why on earth would I put myself through the finances of going into politics and then I have to experience that once I'm in there? So that's something that was mentioned in my interviews, but it's like, this is a huge deterrent for minorities to enter politics. And I guess the third barrier to politics for minorities is just the inequalities that exist in Britain today. You know, politics is no different to any other sector. Minorities are disadvantaged across all areas of British life. And you know, politics unfortunately reflects the kind of structural disadvantages they face. So the fact that we see this underrepresentation in politics is because we see underrepresentation in all other areas. And Angela spoke about how the paths of politics have changed now. So they're less about, well, trade unions obviously do offer some paths still, but when you look at the journey some politicians go on, it's, you know, lawyers, it's people who've worked in business, it's people who have a lot of disposable income. Minorities are less likely to work in those particular sectors than their white counterparts, so they face disadvantages when it comes to those routes to politics. And in terms of ways we can solve this, so I asked these MPs, because I wanted to end on an optimistic note in these interviews, because it was all quite sad with some of the things they were saying to me. And I asked them, what are the things we can do to improve the path to politics for minorities who obviously come from working class backgrounds? And they spoke about how there needs to be a cultural reset in politics. Politics needs to be a space where people can feel welcome. If you look at the architecture in House of Commons, it's an incredibly adversarial place. The benches face each other. It's a very tight space. It's a constant shouting match. I mean, people who watch, you know, Prime Minister Questions for the first time would be absolutely distraught in terms of some of the shouting that goes on in there. That's not a space conducive for people from particular backgrounds who already face discrimination in their day-to-day lives, who have to experience racism, all these other issues. Entering this adversarial space is not ideal for these people. So it's about making politics less adversarial, a kind of more peaceful space, which is easier said than done, right? So there are other solutions in terms of parties need to do a better job as well. And the MPs I interviewed spoke about how there needs to be more support from parties, both in terms of financial support for candidates, but also in terms of like mental and moral support. So when, you know, MPs are abused, they want an arm to be, you know, around them when these things happen, like Diane Abbott or whoever else might receive some racist abuse on Twitter or anything else. There needs to be more support from parties. That's something that was said to me. And I guess the final thing was diversifying the routes of politics. So less lawyers and businessmen in politics, and more people from ordinary walks of life, care workers, social workers, teachers. These people have rich experiences that would really enhance our politics. And I think it's important that we actually look to have those routes of politics as opposed to kind of conventional routes, which are now routes in business and law and other sectors. So I do think there is reason to be optimistic, as kind of Angela ended her notes on as well, and Rainbow did too. There is progress that's been made. We do see huge progress at every general election since 2010. Both the Labour and Conservative parties have made huge jumps when it comes to representation. But I guess the caveat is a lot of these MPs don't come from like working class backgrounds, these minority MPs. They tend to come from backgrounds that are quite privileged. They work in law, they've worked in other kind of wealthy sectors. So it is important that, yes, we celebrate the success in terms of diversity in politics when it comes to race, but also acknowledge that there needs to be more done when it comes to class as well.
Thanks, Michael. That was really interesting how the policy targets you identified to improve minority ethnic representation are weirdly similar to the policy targets to improve class representation. Lisa, on to you.
Thank you. So it's a bit of an interesting one. I've sat in rooms like this over the past sort of 12 years. I started my activism journey when I was 11, and I'm now 22. And you'd be surprised how many times you're asked the question by MPs, for example, what can we do to be more representative? What can we do to drive change? And knowing that I've been one of the young people in those rooms to provide solutions and provide answers, but yet 12 years later, you've still not seen any improvements or any changes, is phenomenal to me. So one thing that Angela mentioned was that living experience is important, as well as being able to connect with other people and hearing more diverse opinions and thoughts. I think young people, working class people, have been shouting the shout for a long time, and suggestions have been made, but they've just been ignored. Which is why you end up finding a situation where you've got groups, grassroots groups, that come in a flurry to basically do the work that we wished our representatives were doing. And I'll give you another example, personal example. This was during the pandemic. I was on a webinar series with an amazing panel for British Futures, and Sajid Javid was one of the members. After the whole talk, anyway, he turned around and was like, here's my personal email, let's work together, let's do something. I've not heard from him since then. And then you had someone within the audience that had listened into the webinar and actually found me and was like, what can we do? Let's do something, let's work together. And I presented my solution, and that's why Grassroots Graduates is something that I can proudly say that I've been able to co-found today. Grassroots Graduates is a modernized job board that is looking to specifically target people of color or young people of color into professions that may seem a bit exclusive to them. And that brings me on to my point about opportunity. If you have that one person, that one individual that believes in a certain cause and a certain mission, and they pick you up, they pick up a working class young person, or just pick up a young person with bright ideas, and provide them with an opportunity and support them all the way through, you will have change. So in order to boost representation within Parliament, we need to get politicians to a place where they're comfortable with change. And change at this moment may seem a bit uncomfortable to them because of how they've lived and how they've always lived. And if a specific rule has worked for them all these many years, why would they want to change it? They would just only want to evolve and add on to that. Which then, I mean, when we talk about opportunities, I have to give homage to Reclaim. Reclaim founded me. I would not be here today if not for Reclaim. Reclaim is an organization that works specifically with working class young people to provide them with that opportunity that maybe only middle class people would get, for example. I kid you not, 12 years ago, I would definitely not have the confidence to stand in front of you guys and speak so fluently as I have done. So thank you, Reclaim, for that. They gave me a platform. They inspired me to want to be part of social change, which is why I've been involved with so many different projects. So when we talk about why representation and working class representation is important, the first thing is being able to see yourself represented in politics is so motivating. Not being able to see yourself makes you feel like you're not represented. And if you're not being represented, then what does that say about our democracy in the UK? Having working class people within politics as well provides this diversity of thought. And when we talk about diversity of thought, it's bringing a variety of different opinions and understandings together to formulate a policy, for example, that will benefit the majority rather than benefiting a specific pocket of people. So then, how do we challenge that? How do we provide solutions for that? Again, they're very simple. I've probably repeated myself 1,000 times with this, and that's why I want to say thank you to one of the questions that was asked at the start to Angela. Making PHSE and citizenship compulsory again within schools. I have no idea why it was removed from the curriculum, but if you're giving young people at secondary school level the tools to know to know how the country operates, to know how certain life decisions that they make will have an impact on them tomorrow. If you can teach young people these skills from an earlier point, you're igniting that fire for them wanting to be a part of politics or understand politics a bit more. I remember growing up and feeling like politics was this white man with like old people, rich people type of scheme, and I could never ever see myself venturing into those doors. And I'm sure a lot of people feel that way today as well. So it's sad that there's, there's not that much progressive change in there. The second sort of suggestion that I would say, of course, is supporting these grassroots groups or charities or organizations that are doing the work that our politicians should essentially be doing. Supporting them more gives them room to grow and just ensures that they're being able to support more young people. Because you don't have that, you end up finding yourself in a situation where a lot of these great groups that are doing amazing works dissolve, and then falling back into the hands of wanting to lean on or rely on their members of parliament to pick up the work that they're doing, but we're just being ignored. So I think that brings me nicely into an interesting campaign that I was a part of in 2019, with Reclaim. This campaign was called the If We Did This. It's exactly what it says on the tin, if we did this. So what our aim was to basically show how the behaviors at the time that we were seeing from our representatives, the language that they were using within Parliament, how awful and atrocious it was. We wanted to let our MPs know that if we were to behave the way that they do, coming from a working class background, the outcome and the consequences would be a lot dire than what they get. And we see that to this very moment, which is why I'm very proud of that campaign. As well as onside that, we did something very sort of like fun in my opinion, because we got to sort of laugh in the face of MPs. So we made like a mock election campaign video, and we were basically asking to raise funds to allow us to go to a private school, so that we could get the same education as our MPs. And we took inspiration from the story of Dawn Butler when she went into Parliament one day and she was mistaken for a cleaner. So what we did was attach badges onto us to make it clear that I am not a cleaner, but I am actually an MP ready to vote. So those are a few examples of really impactful campaigns that we've done to challenge this very same thing that we talk about here today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That was really enjoyable to listen to, and I liked how you sort of thought about institutions beyond the trade union to get more working class people into politics. I think that's quite important to the world today. Michael, last but not least, let's hear a comparative perspective.
Well, thank you for having me here. It has already been a trip worthwhile, I think. My guys just flew in from Vienna just to listen to Angela. I wish we had more inspirational progressives also in other countries, like Austria. So, and let me start off with, well, we at FS Democracy, what we try to do is, well, this is not an issue that's just unique to UK, but it's actually an issue that concerns all of, at least, European democracies. And what we try to do is, well, to do a comparative analysis of 5 national parliaments. And we looked at UK, France, Spain, Poland, and Turkey. And we looked at gender, age, social class, and education, and the first 2 obviously are not that hard to gather data on, but the other 2 are quite tedious because you actually have to look up all of the backgrounds online, and it's often not that easy. It's a language barrier. There's also not a methodology that you can easily use. But we did that, and we found very interesting results. I think that might add to this conversation what we just had. Among them are that we live in what we call a diploma democracy. So the share of university-educated people is actually, in all those 5 countries, over 85%. So that speaks volumes because we looked at different kind of political systems. As we know that the UK is a 2-party system, it might actually have some effects, but that's true in France, Spain, Turkey, and Poland. So there's this development that's concerning everyone, not just one country. but then we also, because when we envisioned this project, and I tried to enter this topic in conversations with politicians, because what we usually do, we try to do policy advice. And we said you should look at social class representation. What they usually say is, why does it matter? Isn't it important what we decide on if that's an unequally skewed result? And what we usually say and ask them is say, well, imagine you had an all-male parliament. Would that be comfortable? And everybody would say, no, probably not. We would lack some very important perspectives. We know that. And then you go on and say if it's just all people. And then we say, oh, if it's only upper class people. And then the conversation starts to go. Even though then it's a very hard one, because it usually is about, well, how they select their own candidates, and then it's something that's very not really popular within parties. And because what I think is even more important to not only see that there's a lot of highly educated people and upper class people in parliament, it's also within this upper class who it is. And this class system we use that differentiates between higher grade managers, sociocultural experts, that would be like teachers, all with a university degree, like secondary teachers. But then you go on to self-employed people that are in the upper class, but also technical experts like IT engineers. And we even lack those. So among the upper service class that is in parliament, 73% in the UK case are upper management people. So they would be especially what we call career politicians, those that have been in politics all their life. So they've only seen this perspective. And they are actually more concerned about how to win the next election, how to enter office. And we know this from other research you will be hearing soon, I think, that it's important and what your motivation is that in politics. If it's about representing the best interests of your constituents, or is it about strategic wins in terms of a party competition perspective, so in terms of how to win the next election. So with this in mind, I think it says even more that because we heard about that money in politics is an issue when it comes to representation and entering lists and being actually on the ballot. But it's actually less an issue in Spain because of the different system, but they also end up with this kind of representation gap. So, and what does that mean? And I'm actually, I don't have an answer to this, but I hope the conversation might go in this direction. But I want to leave you with some stats, because I think numbers are also important to give to this discussion. And for the UK, we found that we're 34% women in parliament. That's really bad. It's a little better in Spain and France with 42 and 44%, and it's just above the EU average with 31%. The working class share we found is 2%. And do we know how many people we have in the population that are working class? It's 40 to 50%. So the gap is huge. Then we already heard the upper service class is 88.8%. Among those, mostly upper managers. The lower grade service class, this would be like elementary teachers and stuff like this, 5.6%. Small business owners, only 3.5%, like those that actually also are struggling because they're working on their own often. And yes. And this is not really different in other countries. We have some interesting results we can maybe come to if people are interested, but I don't want to bother you with that. Yes, so that's what I think I will stop at, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Michael. So we'll open up the floor for some questions. We've got all of 10 minutes, so maybe we'll try and do 2 rounds. I'm not going to be the person that stops people getting to that warm bottle of wine. Right, I'm going to stand up because I can't see arms. Can we come to the lady in the middle row here, and then to Tarek behind her?
Thank you. I'm Lily. I'm with the think tank Demos. We've talked a lot about breaking the barriers for descriptive representation and getting more people from obviously working class backgrounds, ethnic minorities into power. But do you think there are more structural changes to be made once they get there? And does that necessarily equate substantive representation and actually effective policy changes being made, just having like the numbers in Parliament as opposed to actual policy being affected?
Thanks. I'm going to take another question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tarek Abushadi. I'm a political scientist at Oxford. I was wondering about your opinion on measures to close the representation gap, and specifically institutional measures to do something about the change, because saying, well, we need a cultural change, of course, but how do we get there? And two specific things I was wondering about. You talked a lot about, or everyone talked to a certain degree about unions. So I was wondering, what are other organizations, institutions that can take up the roles that unions have played in this? Because we know that unions have done a good job in bringing men from the production sector to parliaments, but for everything else, also unions didn't do so much in the past. And my second question would be something that didn't come up at all, is quotas. So we know that quotas have been a very effective tool in increasing representation for women. And we also know that all the worries have not come true, in the sense of we have not more incompetent parliaments or all other things that have been thrown at this idea. So quotas have been very effective. So why not more quotas would be my second question.
Thanks. Okay, should we take one more? Okay, go on. Let's do one more. Let's go to this gentleman here.
Thank you. Patrick Newman from Stevenage. Whilst Angela was speaking, I was turning through my mind what would be her prospects if she was looking for a seat now. Here we have a fairly left-wing, firebrand, working-class person with a strong regional accent, and I just wonder if even the Labour Party now is too purged to entertain selecting somebody like her.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, so a question from Lily from Demos about descriptive versus substantial representation. And Michael, I might ask you to respond to that, particularly with a race lens, and maybe Rainbow from a gender lens. And then a question from Tarek about pipelines towards getting more diverse people into politics. And Lisa, maybe I'll come to you for that, as well as anyone else who wants to pitch in while you've got the mic. And maybe Rainbow specifically about the quotas element of that. And then finally, the question from Patrick about the current Labour Party and whether Angela would get in that. I think I'll leave that open for everyone to come into. And Michael, maybe I'll come to you as well about the descriptive versus substantial representation. Okay, Michael, you've got the mic, so you might as well start.
Yeah, I think the question on descriptive and substantial representation is an interesting one, because one of the reasons we want a more diverse politics, as Angela said, is because we want these broad interests to be in our politics. And I guess the short answer is there's no guarantee that once we have more people from a minority background, for example, that we're going to see more minority interests represented. And that's partly because of the class that some of these minority MPs come from. So they are quite detached from some of the experiences that most minorities generally would experience. So for example, there's a report that came out the other day that I think 4 in 5 minority households only have £1,500 when it comes to savings. That's not the reality for lots of MPs. So how can they relate to that experience? How can they voice that experience in politics articulately? A lot of them don't understand that kind of life, really. But there is some work done by MPs from minority backgrounds once they're elected, and I guess there is an ideology breakdown here. So MPs who represent parties of the left, I find in my research, are more likely to voice their or kind of raise interests of minorities. So speak about issues like Windrush and the kind of Grenfell fire when that happened, and people like David Lammy, he was very vocal around that time. So was Diane Abbott and Dawn Butler. These MPs were quite vocal. On the right, there tends to be less of a focus on race, and on the right, the kind of approach to issues of race has been a colourblind approach. So you don't accentuate race, you don't focus on issues of race, you focus on, no, we're just people. You know, race isn't actually important. But I do think it is important to, obviously, as we all know, to kind of address these issues head on as opposed to kind of avoiding them. So there is no guarantee that once we have representatives from diverse backgrounds, we're going to have these interests represented. But there is some link, and I think there is something about ideology there.
Okay, should we go to Rainbow next?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the relationship between descriptive and substantive representation is complex. And one of the reasons is because descriptive representation is intersectional. So it's not enough to have X% women or X% from an ethnic minority, exactly as Michael said, if they in themselves are not a diverse group, but only a subgroup of the group that they're supposed to be representing. And it's also worth bearing in mind that MPs are first and foremost party political. So they have to toe the party line. So the real question is, do they have sufficient numbers within the party to change the party line? And they often find that they have to pick those battles very carefully. That there will be a few occasions when they can maybe mobilise together, maybe stick their necks out and fight for something, and there'll be a lot of other times where they have to take a hit for the team. And we've seen women in the Labour Party, for example, criticised for voting for things that were argued to be going against women's interests. The fact is they mobilised behind the scenes, they tried to change it, they couldn't, and then they couldn't jeopardise their careers by voting against a party when they were going to be outnumbered anyway and were going to lose. So we don't always see everything that happens. Sometimes it's stuff that goes on behind the scenes. But the clear message is that you need the numbers. You need to have a sufficient presence, and you often see that without those numbers, even if people are a bigger minority, they're still minority and they're still marginalised. In terms of institutional changes to close the representation gap, one of the things that I think we really need to do, a really straightforward change, we need to stop selecting candidates so early before a general election. It seems like a small thing, but when we select people 3, 4, 5 years before an election, that is an awfully long time that they have to be a candidate and have to devote time to the campaign. And Michael was absolutely right earlier when he said we had these shorter election cycles. It made the elections much more open. There were some people I interviewed who said the only reason I stood around for office was because it was a snap election. I knew I could take 5 weeks off work because I could use up all my annual leave. I wouldn't lose any pay. I could do it. If I'd had to do it for 3 or more years, it just wouldn't have happened. But the problem is that you have a snap election and then the parties are spooked because they've had to choose their candidates at the last minute. And they think, well, fool me twice, shame on me. I'm going to select them right from the very beginning next time so that when the snap election comes, I've already got all my candidates in place. So it was a moment of respite that opened up opportunity, followed by a reinforcement and retrenchment of the exact patterns that have been excluding people previously. But the evidence suggests that parties don't do better for having their candidates in situ campaigning for years. All you're doing is basically flogging your candidates to death for nothing. So if we could stop doing that, that's a really simple change that would help a lot. I didn't fully understand what the quotas question was. I'm sorry. But just to speak on quotas generally, they have been transformative in the Labour Party. The use of all women shortlists means that the Labour Party now has gender parity in Westminster. And it's the only political party that does. And all the other parties that have tried using softer measures, they don't work, or at least they don't have the same impact. They make a marginal effect rather than a transformative effect. And we see this around the world, that you need to be on board with quotas. They can't just be a symbolic gesture. You actually have to have the will to implement them. But when you do, it can make a really big difference. So we'll definitely advocate that.
Great, thanks. Lisa, maybe I can direct you to follow on from that question in terms of getting more working class people from diverse backgrounds into politics in ways that the trade unions are still key, but ways beyond that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think just to sort of add on to this talk about quotas are great because they get the job done. But where the concern comes from is, are appropriate screening being taken in place? Are people just being brought in for this tokenistic perspective? How do you then challenge that? And it comes to looking at the actual attitudes within Parliament. Until you address particular sort of prehistoric attitudes and beliefs and mindsets, you will see that even though a person might qualify and become a member of Parliament, or someone with just working within Parliament, there isn't a high retention rate because they don't feel valued, because they don't feel respected, and there's other sort of underlying issues that occur within that. When we sort of address the pipeline into politics, this is probably how I would think, coming from a working class background myself, and being someone that once upon a time I actually wanted to go into politics, and then I ran for the hills. When we think about the cost, as well as thinking about my race, thinking about my class, and all these other things that I think make me unique, but are mainly seen as a barrier or a limitation in the eyes of other people. It would start off with just being the first thing is changing that sort of, or promoting MPs, for example, to take personal accountability. I think we live in times now where, sadly, we've had the same sort of government for a decade now, and depending on your personal thoughts and opinions, mine are they're starting to do a bit of a terrible job. A terrible job in regards to just their lack of respect and decency for people that they're supposed to be protecting. How can myself from a working class background feel like that is a space that will care for me, that will take care of me, and that I will thrive in, when you have displays of all sorts that are in the eyes of the public? So changing that sort of, again, I'm going to call it the Westminster persona, changing that will allow the public, or allow working class people, for example, to feel that that is a space that they can venture into. The second thing will be like what I mentioned earlier about that support and those tools from the grassroots up. If you are in schools and you're teaching and you're including politics, a real life curriculum to young people, and including that within the curriculum, you're setting them up with that aspiration to want to be sort of involved in day-to-day activities that will affect them in their life. After that, it's about the sponsorships when it comes to the appropriate stage. Of course, we can't all start applying to become, your MPs and stuff. You've got to have the right qualifications, etc., etc. But I think where we go wrong is these intentional limitations that are put in place, i.e. what school did you go to? If you didn't go to this particular type of school, then maybe this isn't a place for you. That is an unnecessary limitation. Your finances, again, another unnecessary limitation, because your qualification and your expertise should not be defined by how much money you have in your pocket or how much you can accumulate from the bank of mum and dad. So again, another unnecessary limitation that needs to be factored out. If you can get to a place where you're recruiting or you're employing people because they have the right mindset, because they have the right drive and ambition, then you will start increasing that diversity of thought and bringing in people from a working class background and diversifying or increasing representation within Parliament. So those would probably be my 100 steps. Increasing representation.
If there was one thing I want this event to achieve, I hope you reconsider politics. Michael, over to you. Maybe talking both about the descriptive, substantial representation, but also the pipelines question.
Well, on the first question, descriptive or substantive representation, I usually think of this as a three-way argument. Look, like the other project we did at Untitled Democracy at FAS was just looking at turnout, and we find this very clear law that it's these days the young, the lower, the people with lower level of education and the lower social classes who just don't vote anymore. And they say, well, there's nobody who kind of represent my interests. And they're probably right, because we have looked at this executive representation, and like it's this means of like setting up different candidates that there's actually a huge electorate out there that you could reach to actually form progressive majorities. And I think the left is often very preoccupied with getting back old voters instead of finding new ones, even though there's 50% out there. Because if there's other research that gives an interesting tilt to this, and that's what it's called like responsiveness, where they looked at it was done in Germany, in the US and Netherlands, so there's quite a good evidence already, where they looked at the past 30 years and whether the legislators actually responded unequally to social groups. So what I looked at is like major reforms and then measured the preferences of the rich and the poor, if you put it like bluntly. And whenever these preferences diverged, so when the poor wanted something else than the rich, we did what the rich said. And that's even true in Germany, and this is something that like people there were really surprised because they thought like, oh, we're better than the US. We know that it's true there, but it's actually, they didn't find any reform where it was the other way around. And obviously, I think this is a really a puzzle, so to say, because 30 years ago, the representation was a bit better in terms of class and in terms of like not an over-dominance of the upper service class. So what does that mean? We might actually live in a world where there is like bigger forces than what national parliaments can can solve. So it also says a lot about, okay, there's issues that we might have to work together transnationally. Well, that's kind of obvious, but maybe in Brexit Britain not anymore so. So this argument that, it's more than that. And the other one on Purpose of Democracy, well, when we looked at, what we tried to do is like, well, we knew there's this research out there, let's go at parties and say like, how do you select the candidates and measure this? And we tried to set up a project with, I'm not going to name the Progressive Party right now, but it was a party that won actually election. We thought like, how did you select the candidates? They didn't want to do this project. Why? Well, first they were winning, so why should I change a winning team, even though they didn't work really well on representation. And also because it meant like looking at prejudices and how we actually set up systems they all benefited from. And in this environment, it's actually really hard to talk about this. So usually there's a much more bigger resonance when I talk to think tanks or the public which gets this, because they're the ones who feel misrepresented. So that's just, I'm happy to talk about this more afterwards if you're interested outside the UK about this.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. And we've run over, so I'm very sorry. We're going to stop the Q&A, but hopefully our speakers will stick around for a drink. There is some wine behind you. I think there's not very much left for me to say apart from watch this space for an IPPR report about representation coming up quite soon, and then watch this space a few months later for a report about who policy choices represent in the UK, again from IPPR in a little while. I'm getting looks like I've forgotten to say something, but okay, well thanks very much. One last round of applause.